I accidentally found my old credit card that I hadn't seen in 10 years. When I went to the bank to check the balance, the manager went pale. "Ma'am, the balance is $29 million. I had never earned that kind of money. When I found out..." Good day, dear listeners. It's Anna again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Some mornings, the past has a way of finding you when you're not looking for it. I remember the exact date I found the card. A Saturday in early October, when the Virginia maple outside my kitchen window had turned the color of old rust. I was cleaning out the attic, something I had put off for 3 years, the way you put off anything that forces you to touch the edges of a life you've already buried. There were boxes up there I hadn't opened since the divorce, 10 years of avoidance stacked neatly under dust. My name is Claire Harmon. I'm 48 years old. I teach AP History at Jefferson High School in Richmond, Virginia, and I have done so for 19 years. My students call me Mrs. Harmon out of habit, even though I haven't been anyone's wife since 2014. I live alone in a 3-bedroom colonial on Westover Hills Boulevard. Too large for one person, not large enough to feel like anything other than a reminder. I keep a vegetable garden in the back. I grade papers on the porch. I drive a 2017 Honda Accord with a cracked side mirror I've been meaning to fix for 2 years. That was my life, and I had made a kind of peace with it. Careful, quiet, self-contained, safe. The divorce from Richard Harmon had been what people charitably call complicated. We'd been married for 11 years. He ran a private investment and consulting firm, Harmon Capital Group, and I had trusted him the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, which is to say completely and without ever thinking about it. When the marriage ended, I was too exhausted and too heartbroken to fight. I signed what his lawyer, a reptilian man named Philip Crane, put in front of me. I was told our joint accounts had been settled and closed. I was told the numbers were accurate. I believed them. That, as it turned out, was the most expensive thing I ever did. But I didn't know any of that on that October Saturday. I was just a woman standing in a dusty attic, pulling open a cardboard box labeled Office Misc, and finding, beneath a stack of old tax returns and a broken stapler, a credit card. It was a Citibank card, navy blue, with a holographic stripe that caught the attic light. Claire A. Harmon was embossed across the front in raised silver letters. The expiration date read June 18th. Expired for more than 6 years. I had no memory of this card. None. I didn't recognize the account number. I didn't recognize the bank branch listed on a small sticker on the back. I sat down on an old suitcase and turned it over in my fingers for a long time, the dust motes drifting around me in the afternoon light. When did I get this? Why don't I remember it? I almost threw it away. I nearly dropped it in the black garbage bag I was filling with old phone chargers and broken picture frames and the accumulated debris of a former life. But something stopped me. Some small, stubborn instinct I hadn't used in years. I set the card on top of the nearest box and kept working. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the card in front of me and my laptop open. I searched the account number. Nothing public. I searched the bank branch code on the back, a Citibank branch in Arlington, Virginia. I had never lived in Arlington. Richard's firm had an office there. I noted that and told myself it meant nothing. I told myself that for 4 days. On Wednesday, I drove 40 miles to the Arlington Citibank branch during my lunch break. I was still telling myself it meant nothing. I was still prepared for the teller to smile and say, "Ma'am, this account has been closed for years. There's nothing here." I had practically written the scene in my head. I would feel mildly foolish, drive back to Richmond and grade my students' essays on the causes of World War I. The branch manager's name was David Okafor. He was a composed, professional man in his early 40s, and he had the kind of steady face that doesn't surprise easily. He took the card to the back office, asked for my ID, made a phone call I couldn't hear, and returned to the glass-walled conference room where I was waiting. I will never forget the color that left his face. He sat down across from me very slowly, the way people sit when they need a moment to decide what to say. He set a printed statement on the table, face down. He looked at me, then at the paper, then back at me. "Mrs. Harmon," he said quietly, "are you aware of the current balance on this account?" "I assumed it was 0, I said. He turned the paper over. I looked at the number for a long time. I looked at it the way you look at something that cannot be real, the way you look at a shadow that moves against the light. $29,041,880, 7.54. $29 million. In an account with my name on it that I had never touched, never seen, never known existed. "Is this some kind of error?" I asked. David Okafor shook his head very gently. "No, ma'am," he said. "It is not." I drove home in silence. I don't remember the road. I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And as I sat there, in the dark, staring at my cracked side mirror, one thought rose above all the others, slow and inevitable as a tide. Richard knew about this account. Richard had always known. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table until the maple outside the window went from black to gray, to the pale amber of early morning, and I let myself think through things I had spent 10 years refusing to think about. The statement David Okafor had given me told a story, if you knew how to read it. The account had been opened in 2009, 5 years before the divorce, under both our names, with an address in Arlington. I had never signed any opening documentation, which meant either my signature had been forged or Philip Crane had manufactured a paperwork trail during the divorce proceedings that conveniently made this account disappear. The earliest deposits were modest, $50,000 here, $80,000 there. But by 2014, the year of our divorce, the balance had climbed to just over $4 million, fed by a series of large wire transfers from an LLC I didn't recognize, Meridian Solutions Group. After the divorce, the deposits continued. The account had been managed, invested, compounded. 37 separate transactions over 10 years, some of them 7 figures. Someone had been tending this money like a garden while I taught teenagers about the New Deal and drove a car with a cracked mirror. How had I not known? How had I signed the settlement and walked away from $4 million? Because I had trusted them. Because Philip Crane had given me documents labeled Full Asset Disclosure. And I had a lawyer who billed me $300 an hour and apparently never looked hard enough. Because Richard had sat across from me in a mediation room and looked me in the eye and told me everything was accounted for. I made coffee I didn't drink. I walked from the kitchen to the living room to the back porch and stood in the cold morning air looking at my garden. The tomato plants dead and brown, the soil turned for winter. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. Richard Harmon was not a physically violent man, but he was the kind of man who knew how to apply pressure in ways that left no fingerprints. During the marriage, I had watched him dismantle a business partner's career with 3 phone calls and a letter. I had watched him smile while doing it. Philip Crane was his instrument, sharp and expensive and entirely without conscience. If I moved against them, they would know. And if they knew, they would move first. But here was the other thing I understood. Standing there in the October cold, $29 million does not sit in an account with your name on it and belong to someone else. Not legally. Not in the United States of America, with a paper trail and a bank manager who had already seen my ID. Whatever story Richard and Philip had constructed, the foundation had just cracked open. The question was not whether I could fight. The question was whether I was willing to. I went back inside and opened my laptop. I didn't search for lawyers yet. First, I needed to understand exactly what had been taken from me. I spent 3 days in my own dining room, which I converted into something resembling a research station. I pulled out every document I had from the divorce, the settlement agreement, the asset disclosure sheets, the correspondence from Philip Crane, the emails from my own attorney, a decent but not exceptional man named Gerald Park, who had since retired to Florida. I made a spreadsheet. I cross-referenced the account statement David Okafor had provided against every figure in the settlement disclosure. The account did not appear anywhere, not once. It had been cleanly, surgically excised from the paperwork as though it had never existed, but it had existed since 2009. I had 10 years of bank statements to prove it. I called in sick to school on Thursday. I never called in sick. By Friday evening, I had what I needed to understand the scope of it. Richard and Philip Crane had concealed a minimum of $4 million in assets during our divorce proceedings. The remaining $25 million was growth, 10 years of management and investment. But the underlying fraud was the concealment. In Virginia, intentional concealment of marital assets during divorce is grounds for the court to reopen a settlement. I had looked that up at 2 a.m. on a legal information site, reading it 3 times to be sure. And then I made a decision. I was not going to call Richard. I was not going to contact Philip Crane. I was not going to mention the account to anyone in my life. Not my colleague Sandra, not my sister Beth in Charlotte, not a single person, until I had spoken to an attorney, the right attorney. Not Gerald Park and his gentle inefficiency. Someone who specialized in exactly this, financial fraud in divorce proceedings. I wrote down 3 names from my research. The first name on my list was Nancy Walsh. She had a small firm in downtown Richmond on East Carey Street, 3 blocks from the James River. Her website was spare and professional, no stock photos of gavels and scales. Her bio said she had spent 6 years as an assistant U.S. attorney before entering private practice, and that her focus was complex financial litigation in family law. A review from a former client read simply, "She does not lose." I called her office at 8:05 Monday morning, the moment they opened. "I need to speak with Nancy Walsh," I told the receptionist. "It's regarding a divorce settlement from 2014 and a concealed account with a balance of approximately $29 million. There was a brief pause. "Let me see when she can see you today," the receptionist said. I had my first appointment at 11 a.m. I dressed carefully that morning. Dark blazer, pressed slacks. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror before I left. I didn't look like a woman who had just found $29 million. I looked like a high school history teacher who hadn't slept properly in 5 days. But somewhere behind my eyes, something had changed. Something had settled into place the way tumblers settle in a lock. I had been patient for 10 years without knowing I was waiting. Now I knew what I was waiting for. Nancy Walsh was not what I had imagined. I had expected someone severe, a woman who wore her competence like armor. What I found was someone compact and quiet, with reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair and the habit of listening with her whole body still, the way good doctors listen. Her office on East Carey Street was lined with bookshelves and smelled like paper and coffee. She shook my hand once, firmly, sat across from me, and didn't speak for the first 30 seconds after I laid everything on her desk. The bank statement, my copies of the divorce documents, my spreadsheet. She put on her glasses and read. She read for a long time, longer than I expected. Outside her window, the James River glittered in the October mid-morning light, and a delivery truck ground its gears on the street below, and Nancy Walsh read every page without speaking. Finally, she set the papers down. She looked at me over her glasses. "Do you understand what you're looking at?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "He hid assets." "He didn't just hide assets," she said. "He laundered them through an LLC to make them untraceable during the disclosure period. He filed false documentation with the court, and based on what I'm seeing here, his attorney assisted in structuring the concealment. That's not just civil fraud, Mrs. Harmon. If the transfers were made across state lines, and at least 3 of these appear to have been, we're potentially looking at wire fraud under federal statutes." She said this very calmly, the way you describe weather. "What does that mean for me?" I asked. "It means," she said, "that you have a strong case to reopen the settlement under Virginia Code Section 20-107.3. Courts can set aside a divorce decree when fraud is proven. It also means Richard Harmon and Philip Crane may be looking at criminal exposure, which changes the nature of their incentives considerably." She paused. "It also means they will fight you very hard." "I know," I said. "Do you?" She looked at me steadily. "These are people who have had 10 years to build walls around this money. They will have answers for everything. They will have alternative explanations. They will make you look unstable, opportunistic, and confused. I have seen this done to intelligent, credible women, and it works if we let it." She folded her hands on the desk. "So here's what we do first. We don't move publicly. We build the record quietly. I file a formal discovery request directly with Citibank under the right legal framework, requesting the complete account history, every deposit, every transfer, every originating account. I also subpoena the corporate filings for Meridian Solutions Group. If that LLC was set up specifically to funnel money before the divorce, its formation documents will show us who signed them and when." I nodded. My hands were steady in my lap, which surprised me. "There's one more thing," Nancy said. "Don't contact Richard. Don't contact Philip Crane. Don't change anything about your daily life. If they realize you found this account before we have the documentation in order, they will move money. Even with the account frozen, which we'll seek as soon as we file, they have time to complicate things." "How long until we file?" I asked. 3 weeks, she said. "Maybe 4. I want everything airtight." I drove back to Richmond and taught my afternoon classes. I stood in front of 23 16-year-olds and lectured about the economic causes of the Civil War, and I don't think any of them noticed that their teacher was holding a secret the size of a mountain. 2 weeks later, the Citibank records arrived at Nancy's office. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had a different quality than it usually did. Not excitement exactly, but the particular gravity of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. "Come in tomorrow morning," she said. "I need you to see something." I sat across from her the next morning and looked at what Citibank had provided. 147 pages of complete account history, going back to the account's opening in March 2009. Nancy had highlighted certain transactions in yellow. She walked me through them methodically, the way she must have walked juries through evidence in her prosecutor years, building the picture piece by piece. In September 2013, 14 months before our divorce was finalized, there had been a wire transfer of $1.2 million into the account from Meridian Solutions Group. The corporate filing for Meridian Solutions, which Nancy had obtained separately, listed two officers, Richard James Harmon and Victor Shale, his business partner. Meridian had been incorporated in Delaware in August 2013, 12 months before Richard told me he wanted a divorce. The company had no public-facing business, no website, no clients, no product. It existed for one purpose: to move money. In the divorce disclosure Richard had filed with the court, Meridian Solutions Group did not appear, not once. Nancy set a final document on top of the pile. It was an email obtained through the Citibank legal compliance request, an internal message Richard had sent from a Harmon Capital Group account to a Citibank relationship manager in Arlington, dated November 2013. Account ending 7741Ds. Please ensure correspondence goes to Arlington office only. No statements to the residential address. My wife has joint nominal status only for estate purposes. I read it twice. Joint nominal status only. He had put my name on the account as a legal formality, perhaps to establish plausible deniability, perhaps for estate structuring, while ensuring I would never receive any communication about it. He had used my name and my legal identity to house money he intended to keep from me, and then during the divorce, he had erased it from the record. I looked up from the email. Nancy was watching me. "This is the document," she said. "This is the one that proves intent. He didn't accidentally fail to disclose this account. He engineered its invisibility before the divorce proceedings even began." She paused. "Claire, this is the point of no return. Once I file, there's no doing this quietly anymore. He will know, and everything that follows will be a war." The room was very still. Outside, East Carey Street hummed with its ordinary Tuesday traffic. Someone was playing music in a car below, life continuing, indifferent. "File," I said. Nancy filed the petition to reopen the divorce settlement on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Philip Crane had called her office 4 times. She told me this with the mild satisfaction of someone who had expected exactly this response. "He's rattled," she said. "Rattled people make mistakes." She had also filed an emergency motion to freeze the account pending litigation, which the court granted within 24 hours. $29 million locked. Neither Richard nor I could touch it. I taught my Friday classes, came home, and found my car. Someone had scratched 3 long lines across the hood of my Honda Accord, deep, deliberate gouges from the front left corner to the windshield. I stood in my driveway in the cold evening air and looked at it for a long moment. Then I went inside, called Nancy, and sent her photographs. "Document everything," she said. "Save every communication you receive. If anyone contacts you directly, Richard, Diana, Philip, anyone, you tell me immediately and you do not respond." Richard contacted me directly the next morning. He called from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew his voice instantly. 10 years hadn't changed it. It was the same measured, reasonable tone he had used in the mediation room, the tone that sounded like fairness while it was building a cage around you. "Claire," he said, "I think we need to talk like adults." "Contact my attorney," I said, and ended the call. He called 3 more times over the weekend. I didn't answer. On Sunday evening, a car I didn't recognize idled outside my house for 20 minutes before driving away. I noted the time, the make, the partial plate, and sent it all to Nancy. She forwarded it to the police, filing a report. Diana came on Monday. I was pulling into my driveway after school when I saw her standing at my front door in a camel coat, dark hair perfect, the picture of composed indignation. Diana Harmon was 41 years old, 7 years my junior, and she had married Richard 2 years after our divorce. I had never spoken to her directly. I had seen photographs. She was beautiful in the architectural way that requires significant maintenance. "Claire," she said, stepping toward me as I got out of the car, "I know this looks bad, but you need to understand, Richard has already talked to his lawyer, and what you're doing is going to end very, very badly for you. This money is tied up in business structures that you don't understand. You could walk away with a reasonable settlement right now and save yourself years of—" "I'd like you to leave my property," I said. Her composure cracked, just slightly. "Don't be stupid," she said. "You're a school teacher. You don't know what you're getting into." "Leave my property," I repeated, "or I will call the police." She left. I went inside and sat on the kitchen floor for a few minutes, which was not something I would normally do. Then I got up, made tea, and called Nancy to report the visit. The next escalation came from Philip Crane. A letter arrived by courier. Formal, meticulous, and designed to be frightening. It alleged that the account had been established as a business holding vehicle, that my nominal joint status had been documented and explained to my own counsel during mediation, a lie I now had the email to disprove, and that any attempt to claim personal ownership would constitute tortious interference with a legitimate business entity. The letter was 12 pages. It had footnotes. I read it once, set it in a folder, and sent it to Nancy. She called me that evening. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "He's building his defense in writing," she said. "Every word of that letter is going to matter in court, and about half of it contradicts documents we already have." She paused. "Claire, they're scared. Scared people overreach." The court date for the preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out. I had 6 weeks to hold. I held. But on the last Friday of October, Nancy called and told me something I hadn't expected. The court had not only frozen the account, but it also issued a preliminary ruling that the circumstances warranted a full evidentiary hearing. Philip Crane's motion to dismiss had been denied. We were going forward. "Go somewhere quiet this weekend," Nancy told me. "You've done everything right. Let it rest for 2 days." My friend Sandra Burgess, who taught English at Jefferson and had known me for 15 years, had a house on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, which she rented out in summer and left empty in October. She handed me the key on Friday afternoon without asking any questions. That was the kind of friend Sandra was. I drove down Saturday morning, 4 hours south, through flat tobacco country and pine barrens, and arrived at a gray shingled cottage 3 rows back from the Atlantic. The beach was empty. The October ocean was the color of slate, and the wind came in cold and hard off the water, and I walked along the shore for 2 hours without thinking about anything at all. For the first time in 3 weeks, I slept through the night. I came back from the Outer Banks on Sunday evening, rested in a way I hadn't been in years. The stillness didn't last long. On Monday morning, a letter from Philip Crane's office arrived at Nancy's firm, formally styled as a settlement proposal. Richard was offering me $900,000 to be paid in 2 installments, structured as a retroactive correction to the 2014 divorce settlement, in exchange for my withdrawal of the petition and a signed NDA that would prevent me from discussing the account, the litigation, or anything related to Harmon Capital Group with any party for the remainder of my natural life. Nancy read it to me over the phone. 900,000, I repeated. Against a balance of 29 million, she said. I was quiet for a moment. $900,000. More money than I had ever had at once. More than 3 years of my teaching salary. Enough to pay off my mortgage, replace the Honda, take the trip to Italy I had been deferring for a decade. It was real money. It was designed to feel like real money. "What do you think?" I asked Nancy. "I think you should do whatever you decide is right," she said carefully. "But professionally, I think they are offering you 3 cents on the dollar because they believe you can be frightened into taking it. If they believed you didn't have a case, they wouldn't be offering anything." "Tell them no," I said. I heard the quiet in her voice that meant she'd expected that. "I'll respond formally tomorrow." What I didn't tell Nancy, what I didn't tell anyone yet, was that the days at the beach had done something more than rest me. Walking that empty October shore, I had understood something I hadn't been willing to look at clearly before. This wasn't just about money. $29 million was an abstraction. What it represented was not. Richard had stood in a mediation room and sworn under oath that he had fully disclosed all marital assets. He had lied. He had forged or manufactured documentation. He had engineered my departure from our marriage with the deliberate intention of leaving me with nothing while he walked away with everything. He had counted on my trust, my grief, and my ignorance, and for 10 years it had worked perfectly. The 900,000 was still counting on my fear. I declined to be afraid anymore, or rather, I decided that fear was no longer a reason to stop. But I also knew I couldn't do this alone, not psychologically. I had Sandra, who knew nothing beyond the fact that I was in some legal business. I had Nancy, who was my attorney, not my friend. And I had myself rattling around in a 3-bedroom house, dealing with scratched car hoods and women in camel coats on my doorstep. I started looking, and I found a support group. It was called Recovered Ground, a nonprofit based in Richmond that offered peer support for women who had experienced financial abuse in marriage and divorce. They met on Wednesday evenings at a community center on Broad Street. 12 to 15 women in folding chairs in a beige room with terrible fluorescent lighting, drinking bad coffee and telling the truth. I went the first Wednesday in November. I sat in the back. I didn't say much. I listened. The woman who ran the group was named Marion Collins. She was 63 with close-cropped silver hair and the no-nonsense warmth of someone who had seen everything and retained her compassion through the seeing. She had been a family law paralegal for 20 years before her own marriage ended in what she described as a master class in legal manipulation. She had started Recovered Ground 8 years earlier. After the meeting, she poured me a cup of terrible coffee and sat next to me. "First time?" she asked. "That obvious?" "You're the only one who didn't take a cookie," she said. "People who've been coming a while have learned to take the cookies. It's not much, but it helps." I laughed. It surprised me. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. I went back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. Marion's group didn't give me legal advice or financial counsel. What it gave me was something more fundamental, the understanding that what had happened to me was not a personal failing, that I had not been foolish or weak. I had been deliberately deceived by people who were skilled at it. That's a different thing entirely, and the distinction matters enormously when you are deciding how hard to fight. The women who win, Marion told me one evening as we stacked chairs after the others had left, aren't the ones who are the angriest. They're the ones who get the angriest and then get very, very calm. I thought about that on the drive home through the November dark. I was getting very calm. They came on a Saturday. I was in the back garden turning the dead vegetable beds for the last time before winter when I heard the doorbell. I walked around the side of the house, still holding my garden fork, and found Richard and Diana standing at my front door. Richard was in a charcoal overcoat. He had aged well, and he knew it. Silver at the temples now, the kind of distinguished gray that men acquire and women are supposed to apologize for. Diana stood slightly behind him, her expression arranged into something she intended to read as concern. They looked like a couple who had come to offer condolences. I did not open the screen door. "Claire," Richard said, "I know we've had a rough few weeks. I was hoping we could sit down and talk like reasonable people, without the lawyers for once." "You're not supposed to contact me directly," I said. "Your attorney is aware of that." "I know, and I know this isn't strictly." He tried a small, self-deprecating smile. He was very good at small, self-deprecating smiles. "Claire, I owe you an apology. The way the account was structured was complicated, and I understand that from the outside it looks like fraud," I said pleasantly. "Your attorney can discuss it with mine." Diana stepped forward. Her mask slipped slightly at the edges. I could see it. "Claire, I want to be direct with you, woman to woman. Richard has worked extremely hard to build what he's built. This account represents years of legitimate business proceeds. What you're trying to do is take money that legally and ethically belongs to his business, and you are going to destroy his career and his reputation, and I won't pretend this doesn't affect me personally." "Then don't pretend," I said. She blinked. "Diana," I said, "you married a man who committed perjury in a courtroom and hid $4 million from his wife while she was grieving the end of their marriage. That's who you chose. I'm not responsible for the consequences of his choices." Richard's pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went flat and cold. I had seen that look before. Once, years ago, when a contractor had disputed a bill and Richard had calmly told him to expect trouble. The contractor had quietly dropped the dispute. "Claire," he said very quietly, "I'm trying to give you an opportunity to resolve this in a way that works for everyone. The alternative is years of litigation, depositions, your finances, your life, your testimony examined by my legal team. We will find every inconsistency, and I want to be clear about this, every vulnerability in your case and in your history. Is that really what you want?" There it was, under the apology, under the concern, under Diana's woman-to-woman sincerity. The same blade he had always used, wrapped in the same reasonable voice. "Get off my property," I said. "Both of you, now." "Claire, I'm going to count to 10 and then I'm calling the police. I'm also going to send my attorney a recording of this conversation." I held up my phone, which I had started recording when I heard the doorbell. I had learned. 1. They left. I went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a few minutes. I'm not going to claim I was completely unmoved. My hands were not entirely steady. Richard's voice, even after 10 years and everything I now knew, still carried a residual weight, the way things do when they have been the defining sound of your life for over a decade. And his threat was not empty. Litigation is brutal regardless of which side you're on, and Philip Crane was very good at what he did. But here was what I noticed. The fear was there, and it was also fuel. I was afraid of what they might do, and that fear clarified everything with perfect precision. It reminded me exactly what was at stake. Not money, though the money was real. What was at stake was the decade of my life they had already taken, the quiet poverty of my 3-bedroom house and my cracked car mirror and my careful small existence, while Richard and Diana lived in a colonial revival house in McLean on $29 million that partly had my name on it. I sent the recording to Nancy. She called me back within 15 minutes. "They just handed us a gift," she said. "Coming to your home after a no-contact directive from the court, attempting to persuade you to withdraw litigation. I'm filing a motion for contempt first thing Monday." "Good," I said. I called Marion that evening. She didn't say much. She mostly listened, the way she always did. But at the end, she said, "Do you know what the word contempt means in law?" "A violation of court order," I said. "No," she said gently. "In Latin, it means to despise. They held the court in contempt because they hold you in contempt. They think you're still the woman who signed the papers without looking." She paused. "Make sure they find out otherwise." The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in December in the Richmond Circuit Court, Courtroom B, 3rd floor. I arrived at 8:15, 45 minutes early. The courthouse was a solid granite building on East Broad Street, 3 blocks from where Nancy had her office, and the morning was cold enough to see your breath. I wore a dark wool dress and my good coat, the navy one I kept for parent conferences and funerals. I carried a folder with my notes. I had slept 6 hours. Not a full night, but enough. Nancy was already in the corridor outside the courtroom, speaking quietly with a paralegal. She looked at me when I approached, assessed me the way she had learned to assess me over these weeks, and seemed satisfied with what she found. "Victor Shale confirmed yesterday," she said. "He's here, and he's testifying." Victor Shale had been Richard's business partner from 2008 to 2019, when they had parted ways in a dispute over Harmon Capital Group's direction. He was now under a separate IRS investigation involving another set of financial irregularities, which made him, as Nancy had noted when she first contacted him, someone with significant incentive to demonstrate cooperation with authorities. He had agreed to testify about the formation of Meridian Solutions Group and its intended purpose. In exchange, his attorney was negotiating with federal investigators. Richard arrived with Philip Crane and 2 junior attorneys from Crane's firm. Diana was with them. She had no legal standing to be present, but she sat in the gallery anyway, composed and watchful. Richard looked smooth and untroubled. He had been through depositions before. He knew how to perform in a legal context. He hadn't seen the full evidence package yet. Judge Elaine Portis presided. She was in her late 50s, methodical and patient, with a reputation for thoroughness that Nancy had described approvingly. She did not like courtroom theater. She liked documentation. She got documentation. Nancy began with the email, the one Richard had sent to the Citibank relationship manager in November 2013. Joint nominal status only. No statements to the residential address. She presented it calmly, walked the judge through its implications, and then presented the full account history alongside the divorce disclosure Richard had filed with the court in 2014. She placed them side by side, literally 2 exhibits projected on a screen. The Citibank account did not appear in the disclosure, not as a joint asset, not as a business asset, not as a footnote. It did not exist in his sworn documentation. Philip Crane objected 3 times in the first 20 minutes. Judge Portis sustained 1 objection and overruled 2. Then Victor Shale took the stand. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the careful manner of someone who had been coached extensively. He answered Nancy's questions in a flat, deliberate way. Yes, He and Richard Harmon had formed Meridian Solutions Group in August 2013. Yes, the purpose had been to consolidate personal funds that Richard wished to keep separate from Harmon Capital Group's public accounts. Yes, he had been aware that Richard was in the early stages of divorce proceedings at the time of Meridian's formation. Had he been told the reason for the timing? Shale looked at his hands. Richard told me he needed a clean separation of his personal assets before the settlement, so they couldn't be counted. The courtroom was very quiet. Philip Crane's cross-examination of Shale was aggressive and went on for 40 minutes. It did not ultimately change what Shale had said. What he said was on the record. Then it was Richard's turn. Philip Crane's direct examination was composed and professional. Richard's responses were polished. He had explanations for everything. The account had been a business structure, a legitimate vehicle for investment proceeds. The non-disclosure in the settlement had been a clerical oversight, corrected by accompanying documentation that should have been filed by his counsel. He was calm and articulate and believable, the way he always was. Nancy waited. When it was her turn, she began very quietly. She walked him through the email, line by line. She asked him to explain what he meant by joint nominal status only. He explained it. She asked him to confirm that he had personally written the email. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm the date, November 2013. He confirmed it. She then asked him to confirm the date he had told me he wanted a divorce. "I don't recall the exact date," he said. She showed him a text message from his phone, obtained through the legal discovery process, sent to his attorney, Philip Crane. Dated October 2013, ready to initiate. "Make sure the Arlington account is completely off the table before we file anything." She read it aloud. Once. Philip Crane said, "Objection, Your Honor, this document's provenance was established in prior submission," Nancy said, pages 41 through 47 of Exhibit C. Judge Portis looked at Richard, and Richard Harmon, for the first time in the 11 years I had known him, did not have his answer ready. He looked at Philip Crane. Philip Crane looked at the table. Richard looked back at the judge. He started to speak. He stopped. He tried again. The context of that message is, there are business considerations that, the phrasing is perhaps. Diana stood up in the gallery. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly. "This is a witch hunt, and everyone in this room knows." "Ma'am," said Judge Portis, with the quiet authority of someone who has never had to raise her voice, "sit down, now. One more outburst, and you will be removed." Diana sat. 2 spots of color burned in her cheeks. I sat at the plaintiff's table and watched all of this and felt almost nothing, which was its own kind of remarkable. Not numbness. I was completely present, completely clear. I had spent months afraid of this room, afraid of Richard's competence and Philip's ruthlessness and the sheer weight of the resources they could deploy against me. And now I was here. And the email was on a screen, and Victor Shale had said what he said, and Richard was trying to explain a text message that needed no explanation. I folded my hands on the table. I waited. Judge Portis issued her preliminary ruling 2 weeks after the hearing. Nancy called me the moment it came through. "Read it to me," I said. I was standing in my classroom after hours, the December afternoon dark outside the windows, the last of my students' papers still spread across my desk. The court finds sufficient evidence of deliberate and material misrepresentation in the 2014 divorce settlement of Harmon versus Harmon, Nancy read, and I could hear her trying to keep the satisfaction out of her voice and not entirely succeeding. The settlement agreement of March 2014 is hereby set aside in its entirety. The Citibank account ending in 7741 is declared a marital asset subject to equitable distribution proceedings. She paused. Claire, it's all set aside. The whole settlement. I sat down on the edge of my desk. All of it, I said. All of it. We start from scratch, as if 2014 never happened. Everything goes back on the table. The equitable distribution hearing took place in late January. It was, in some ways, anticlimactic. The hard work had been done. Nancy presented a comprehensive accounting of all marital assets, including the Citibank account, Harmon Capital Group's valuation as of the divorce date, and a calculation of what I should have received under Virginia's equitable distribution statute in 2014. Richard's legal team mounted a defense, but it was the defense of people who had already lost the central argument. Judge Portis awarded me $14.7 million, representing my equitable share of the concealed account plus interest, plus my recalculated share of the other marital assets that had been undervalued in the original settlement. She also ordered Richard to pay my legal fees, which were significant, and imposed a civil penalty for the fraudulent disclosure, $14.7 million. I remember writing that number down on a notepad and then staring at it for a very long time, but it didn't end there, because it was never just a civil matter. The evidence Nancy had built, the Meridian Solutions documentation, the communication records, the testimony of Victor Shale, had been provided to the Virginia State Bar and to the Richmond office of the FBI. Philip Crane was the first to feel it. The Virginia State Bar launched a formal disciplinary investigation into his conduct in the 2014 settlement. In February, he was suspended pending investigation. By spring, the suspension had become disbarment proceedings. A man who had spent 30 years building a career as one of Richmond's most formidable divorce attorneys lost his license because he had helped his client commit perjury. He didn't go quietly. He appealed and hired his own attorneys and issued statements through them. None of it made any difference. Richard's situation was more complicated and more serious. The FBI investigation, which had begun as an outgrowth of the civil case, but had expanded considerably once investigators had access to Meridian Solutions' financial records, encompassed not just the marital asset concealment, but a broader pattern of financial structuring that had implications beyond our divorce. I didn't follow every detail of the investigation. Nancy kept me informed of the parts that were relevant to my case, and I kept the rest at arm's length. I had enough to manage. What I knew was this. By March of that year, Richard Harmon was under federal indictment on 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of perjury. He surrendered his passport. His assets were partly frozen pending the criminal proceedings. Harmon Capital Group's clients, who had been watching the civil case with increasing alarm, began withdrawing funds. The firm, which had managed north of $200 million at its peak, shrank to a fraction of that within months. Diana filed for divorce in April. I heard this from Sandra, who had heard it from someone in the Richmond legal community. I sat with the information for a moment and felt, not satisfaction exactly, something more neutral. The recognition that the world had arranged itself accurately and that there was a kind of orderliness in that. On the day the funds were transferred to my account, a morning in late March, overcast, the first crabapple blossoms just opening on the tree in my neighbor's yard, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad and wrote down 3 things I knew for certain. 1. I had been wronged deliberately by people who believed they were too clever and too powerful to be caught. 2. I had fought back carefully with the right person beside me, and I had not panicked, and I had not settled, and I had not let them frighten me into accepting less than I was owed. 3. The cracked mirror on the Honda Accord could finally be fixed. That last one made me laugh, alone at my kitchen table on a gray March morning, and it was the best laugh I had had in a very long time. The first thing I did was take a leave of absence from Jefferson High. I had been there 19 years, and the school had been my anchor through some difficult seasons. But anchors can also be what holds you in place when the tide has changed, and the tide had changed completely. Sandra cried when I told her, which surprised me, and then hugged me for a long time, which didn't. I spent the spring doing nothing in particular. I fixed the car's mirror and traded the Honda in. I had a contractor replace the rotting back porch I'd been ignoring for 6 years. I slept. I cooked dinners that took longer than they needed to because I finally had the time. In June, I went to Italy. I had deferred this trip for 9 years. 3 weeks in Florence, Rome, and a small hill town in Umbria. I stood in the Uffizi in front of Botticelli's Primavera and felt, for the first time in years, something close to uncomplicated wonder. When I came home, I called Marion. We talked for 3 hours and by the end had the outline of something real, a legal aid fund under recovered ground, designated to cover attorneys' fees for women in financial abuse cases who couldn't afford adequate representation. I knew what it meant to have Nancy Walsh in your corner. I made the first donation the following week. By autumn, I had enrolled in an evening certificate program in financial law at the University of Richmond. I was the oldest person in most of my classes by 20 years. I did not mind at all. And Richard? Convicted on both counts of wire fraud. 31 months in federal prison, restitution that zeroed out his remaining assets, Harmon Capital Group dissolved. Philip Crane was disbarred in October. 30 years of practice, gone without appeal. Diana divorced Richard before his sentencing and received considerably less than she'd anticipated. She moved to Northern Virginia. I heard through Sandra that things were difficult. I thought briefly about the woman in the camel coat who had told me not to be stupid. I did not think about her for long. What occupied space now was the fund, which had assisted 7 women by December, and my classes, and the rebuilt porch, and Marion, who called for no particular reason and always said exactly what needed saying, and the Meyer lemon tree in a pot on the new porch, impractical for Virginia winters, requiring constant attention. It had 3 small buds on it by December. I tended them carefully. I ed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. It means more than you know.